verses 13 through 17. As we look at this passage, and then we'll unpack it a little bit. We're told in verse 13, "And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, 'Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?' But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, 'Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius, and let me look at it.' And they brought him one. And he said to them, 'Whose likeness and inscription is this?' And they said to him, 'Caesar's.' Jesus said to them, 'Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.' And they marveled at him." And you notice it's kind of it's a very they come up to him. The scene is set there in verse 13, and you have a group of people, and it has two groups of people coming to Jesus. One group is the Pharisee, and they are being accompanied by the Herodians. The Pharisees were very religious people. The Herodians were not. The Pharisees believed in the nation of Judah, that the nation of Judah should be its own nation. Now, they had different eschatologies of how they would work it out, but they understood that God's people was God's people, and it was separate from the world. In fact, in John, they have a discussion about how they are slaves to no one. And the Herodians were political pragmatists. They were people who aligned with Herod and had aligned directly with the Roman Empire, and they worked with the Roman Empire, and they were part of the Roman Empire, and they followed with the Roman Empire. They were politically and socially aligned with the Roman Empire. And so they came to Jesus with a trap. And it's always interesting, the scenario, how they butter him up there at the beginning about how he's a teacher of God. But they come to him with a trap. And the trap is simple. On the simple level, on a very simple level, they ask him this question: is it lawful, according to the Old Testament is the implication, is it lawful, according to the law of God, to pay taxes to Caesar? After all, we, the people of Israel, are the people of God, who should be subject to no one. So if Jesus answered no, the Herodians would have accused him of rebellion, of sedition, and would have then had reason to try him and attack him. If he said yes, all the people that is Judah and Israel, all the people who had just declared him a few days beforehand king of Israel, would have felt betrayed. It was like, it was a political question. It's kind of like, it was a trap. And politicians often fall for these, especially Republicans are very good at falling for these traps during these debates. You can think of when back there when Mitt Romney was running and they asked him a question about contraception, and he's like, where did this come from? What was this about? Nobody was even talking about that issue. They caught him off guard with it. They wanted to trap him. Well, Jesus could have then done something else. He could have tried to explain his position. You know, it's also kind of like many times when they find out that a politician is a conservative Christian, somebody who accepts the Word of God, invariably they will ask a question about creation. And the whole point of it, they don't really care about the answer. They want an answer that they can then take, and if it smudges on creationism, then they take it to the Christians and say, see, he's not a true Christian, and holds firm to creationism. They say, oh, he's a dummy, he doesn't know anything, and they tear him apart. And so you could go about it and try to give a full explanation. Jesus could have answered trying to give a full explanation, because this was a question to him as a Bible teacher. And my children know that they have to be careful when they ask me a question. Because sometimes I'll start giving them this elaborate answer, and all they want is just a simple answer, and I have to think a little bit about what type of answer they want. But Jesus could have gone back to the very first covenant, or to the second covenant, the Noahic covenant, and he could have pointed out that God had handed over to mankind the rule of law, the rule of ministering the laws and punishing evildoers back in Genesis chapter 9, and therefore he had given humanity the right of self-rule and the right to determine their own laws, and that the Babylonians, God had handed Judah over to the Babylonians. Well, obviously now he had handed them over to the Romans. He could have kind of gone in something like that. Not only would the answer have bored them, but both sides would have torn him up, because they weren't interested in the answer. One thing I've learned over the years, I'll be discussing something with somebody, and I'll make a statement, and then I quickly try to determine, are they really interested in the topic, or are they just looking for something to fight over? And if they're just looking for something to fight over, it's best to go on. Don't waste your time with them. Because you just go from one thing to another, and it doesn't even matter. I've even switched sides completely during a discussion with one of these people, and they switched sides also. So that when I started out arguing, it was like, what's going on here? So I switched complete sides, and then he started arguing what I was arguing. It's like, this guy doesn't want to know anything. There's no point in it. People will do that. There are people like that. Well, he could have gone like that, and they would have tore him up. But he did something different. Because being God, we see there in verse 15, he knew, and this is a very interesting thing, their hypocrisy. He knew their hypocrisy. They weren't merely feinting that he was a good teacher. They weren't merely out to trap him, but even in the question, they were hypocrites. On this. And so he does something to point out the hypocrisy. He simply asks for a denarius. He asks for a coin. And they pull out the coin and they look at it, he hand it to him, and he looks at it. You have to understand that this is occurring in the temple precincts. This is occurring within where the temple sits. Years earlier, Pilate had put an image of Caesar just outside of the temple. And on this image of Caesar, you could still see it from the temple, but there was an image there. And the Jews went into a riot. And he was forced politically to bring down those images unless risking open civil war. Because to the Jews it was sacrilegious to bring into the temple images of pagan deities. And the Roman emperor was considered a pagan deity. So they hand Jesus this coin. And on one side of the coin, there's the Roman goddess of peace. And on the other side of the coin is an image of Tiberius. And the image of Tiberius has this inscription on it. Tiberius, Caesar, worshipful son of God, Augustus. So here in the temple precinct, one of these people who are coming to entrap Jesus over their relation, his view of taxes, hands to him an image of a pagan god that years before, if it was a Herodian, it wouldn't have been an issue, too much of an issue, but still, Herodians would have respected the temple and not brought it in because they want to keep peace. And then here, when it was a Pharisee, here you come out with this image of a false god. And it's kind of ironic when you think about it, because on that coin, Tiberius was claiming to be a son of God. To being the Son of God. And what was Jesus claiming to be? The Son of God. Son of Man. So he points out the hypocrisy, but then he goes a little further, and he looks at the coin and he says, whose image and inscription is on this? And their answer is Caesar's. See, this coin was not just any coin in the Roman Empire. This was a special coin that Caesar himself would have minted. And it was the coin that the Caesar and the government paid their bills with. And when it came time for taxes, it was the coin that you were supposed to use to pay your taxes to the Roman Empire. Just like we talked about earlier, that the temple had its own coinage that you paid the tax. And so what you would do is you would transfer. You would actually exchange types of money for the different types of taxes. You know, it's not like today where we have a uniform monetary system. But it was where you had all these different things. So when you went to pay certain things, you had to have certain types of money. You can imagine how confusing that could be. You had to pay your taxes in federal dollars, your South Carolina taxes in South Carolina dollars. You know, you'd have to, it really kind of get complicated a little bit. But that was the way things were back then. But here they had this Roman coin issued by the Roman government that was part of paying the Roman taxes in the middle of the temple of God, where it was sacrilegious to bring an idol into. Here they have. It's amazing when it comes to money how morals suddenly get loosened up, get a little not so tight. But it was there. Now think about it. On this coin you have that inscription. But for right now, I'm just going to focus on the image. On that coin is an image. The image of Tiberius. This is bust with the divine wreath on. And this brings us back to something important. If you think about it back in creation, when God created mankind, what did he do in Genesis 1, chapter 1, verses 26 and 27? He created mankind in the image of God. We, as individuals, are image bearers of God. God is the one who has minted us and has made us. And so Jesus then simply says, render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but to God the things that are God's. And notice he sums up all the theology in this whole statement. Because God is the owner of every life. God is our owner. God is the one who minted us. His image is impressed upon us. Even though we may be an old, worn-out coin that's been, you've seen those old coins that have been used, so you rarely see the image. It's been marred. It's there, though. It's still there. It was still made. We still are that image bearer. And so the point is this that Jesus is making. That coin, that piece of material may belong to Caesar, and you may be obligated to give it to him, but your lives, including the life of Caesar himself, belong to God. And so when Jesus is saying, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, well, we may pay our taxes, but we still have to pay greater homage to God. And a simple thing we could say is this, is that we as Christians do not submit to earthly authority absolutely. We do submit to earthly authority. We render material submission to our governments, and we do pay our taxes that are required of us. And we give honor to whom honor is due, and tribute to whom tribute is due because of their position. But we also have to remember that we bear the image of God and that our first loyalty is always to God. And so we may at times will refuse the demands of government because they're contrary to the gospel. We can think about the time that Peter and John were taken to the temple and told not to preach in the name of Christ. Well, if our government tells us we cannot preach the gospel, we cannot go out and evangelize, then we will still have to do it because that is what God has commanded us to. We also must stand firm on the fundamental rights of humanity, the right of life. Even though our government may say that it's okay for mothers to kill their unborn children, we still have to preach and teach otherwise and provide ministries otherwise to help people to make, not only if they've made one bad choice, to keep them from making a second bad choice, to keep them from being entrapped by sin. We still must proclaim the gospel of life, that every life is precious to the Lord, and do what we can to protect those lives, to keep those lives from going into destruction. And of course, there are moral things that outweigh anything the government can do. We may have to suffer for saying no to the immoralities within the government or that the government requires. We may have to suffer and stand firm against those things. But that does not mean that we do not honor them, honor government. We just follow a higher authority. You see, Paul talks about, if we live the Christian life, we want a good government so that we can live in peace and so that we can minister and proclaim the gospel freely. That is our purpose there. We want that. Not so much so that we can indulge our desires and our lust or anything of that sort. We desire freedom so that we can proclaim the gospel. So that we can share the gospel with others. So that we can live a peaceful life in humble submission to God. We're not to be people who lead open rebellions, but at the same time, we don't do those things that are contrary to the law of God. And Paul tells us that if we develop the Christian character of joy, peace, truth, develop the fruits of the Spirit, there's no law against those things. Government realizes they need it. So as we come forward to this time and we look at this passage here, we realize that there are certain obligations that we do have to our earthly governments and to those of earthly authority over us. And those are primarily in the material world. But when it comes to things of morality, when it comes to things of who we are and our identity, that belongs to God.